The night was unusually still on the rural stretch of road in South Carolina, cloaked under a canopy of Spanish moss swaying in the humid breeze. The road, flanked by ancient live oaks, seemed to dissolve into darkness as the headlights of Rachel and Mark's car barely illuminated the path ahead. The couple had heard whispers of the Land's End Light, a local legend steeped in mystery and terror, and, out of equal parts curiosity and recklessness, decided to seek it for themselves. "Are you sure about this?" Rachel asked, her voice uneasy. She glanced at Mark, who gripped the steering wheel with an excitement that only fueled her apprehension. "It's just a story, Rach," Mark replied, smirking. "A light that appears on this road, a wandering spirit. What's the worst that could happen?" As the car rolled deeper into the shadowy corridor, the towering trees seemed to lean inward, enclosing them in a claustrophobic embrace. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint hum of cicadas and the crunch of gravel beneath their tires. Rachel leaned closer to the window, peering out into the darkness. "It's creepy out here," she muttered. "I didn't think it'd feel so alive." Mark chuckled, though his bravado faltered slightly. "That's the point. They say the light appears when you least expect it. Maybe we'll get lucky." The legend, as they knew it, told of a Confederate soldier decapitated during a skirmish not far from this very road. The man, now a restless spirit, was said to wander the area in search of his head, a lantern clutched in his spectral hand. Many claimed to have seen the glowing orb drifting along the road, while others swore they'd heard disembodied footsteps, whispers, and even the faint clinking of metal. As the couple reached a particularly dense stretch of trees, Mark pulled the car to a stop. He killed the engine, plunging them into an almost unbearable silence. Rachel's pulse quickened. "Why are we stopping?" she whispered. "We need to turn off the lights," Mark said, his voice barely audible. "That's how you're supposed to summon it." Rachel hesitated, but reluctantly nodded. Mark reached for the switch, and the headlights flickered off. Darkness engulfed them, and for a moment, it felt as if the entire world had ceased to exist. Then, faintly at first, a sound began to creep into their awareness. A rhythmic crunch, like boots on gravel. Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes wide and unblinking. Rachel followed his gaze and saw it, a dim, flickering light hovering in the distance. It bobbed gently, like a lantern swaying in the hand of an unseen figure. "That can't be real," Mark whispered. Yet, even as he said it, the light grew brighter, moving steadily closer. The air around them seemed to thicken, pressing down on their chests. Rachel's ears filled with a low, mournful hum, as if the wind itself carried a dirge. She clutched Mark's arm. "Mark, we need to go. Now." But Mark remained frozen, his eyes fixed on the approaching light. As it neared, they could make out a shadowy figure silhouetted against its glow. The figure was tall and gaunt, its form unnaturally stiff. In one hand, it held the lantern, its light flickering like a dying flame. The figure stopped just short of the car. Rachel's blood turned to ice as she realized what was wrong. The figure had no head. Its shoulders ended abruptly, the empty space above them a black void. A sudden piercing sound shattered the silence, a metallic clang, like a sword being drawn from its sheath. Rachel screamed, snapping Mark out of his trance. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The headless figure raised its free hand, pointing directly at them. The lantern's light flared, flooding the car with an unnatural glow. Mark finally turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Without hesitation, he slammed his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, the tires spitting gravel as they sped away. Rachel twisted in her seat, watching as the figure grew smaller in the rearview mirror. But the light didn't fade. It followed them, keeping pace no matter how fast they drove. "Mark, it's still there!" Rachel cried. "I'm going as fast as I can!" he shouted, his voice tinged with panic. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees blurring into a wall of shadow. The light grew brighter, almost blinding, as if it was closing in on them. Rachel covered her face, bracing for the worst. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. The oppressive weight lifted, and the road ahead was dark and silent once more. Mark eased off the gas, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. Rachel sat in stunned silence, her heart pounding. "What just happened?" she finally managed to ask. "I don't know," Mark replied, his voice hollow. "But we're never coming back here." As they drove away from the haunted stretch of road, the Spanish moss swayed gently in the breeze, as if bidding them a quiet farewell. But deep in the shadows, a faint light flickered once more, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitors. Mark and Rachel drove in tense silence, the car's headlights piercing through the shadowy corridor of trees. The oppressive atmosphere of the road seemed to follow them, wrapping around the car like a suffocating shroud. Rachel's gaze darted nervously between the road and the dark woods. "This isn't right," Rachel muttered. "It feels like we're going in circles." Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "We're fine. We'll hit the main road soon." But his voice lacked confidence. Just as he spoke, the car jolted violently, veering off course. Mark slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. "What was that?" Rachel asked, panic rising in her voice. Mark climbed out, muttering under his breath. He crouched by the front tire, groaning. "It's flat. Must have hit something." Rachel reluctantly stepped out, the thick, humid air wrapping around her like a cloak. The trees loomed above them, their Spanish moss swaying in the breeze. Every sound, the crunch of gravel, the distant rustle of leaves, seemed amplified. Then they heard it. A faint crunch of footsteps on gravel, growing louder. Rachel grabbed Mark's arm, her voice a trembling whisper. "Mark, someone's coming." They froze, listening as the footsteps drew closer. A flickering light appeared in the distance, its glow bobbing rhythmically. Mark's heart sank. He didn't need to say it. They both knew what was coming. "Hide," Rachel urged, pulling Mark toward the trees. They ducked behind a thick trunk, the rough bark pressing against their backs. Rachel peeked around the edge, her breath catching as the light grew brighter. The headless figure emerged, its lantern casting long, eerie shadows across the road. Its tattered uniform swayed as it moved, the empty space where its head should have been a chilling void. The metallic clink of a sword echoed in the still air. The figure stopped near their car, raising the lantern as if inspecting it. Then, slowly, it turned. The light from the lantern illuminated the woods, its glow piercing through the shadows. Rachel held her breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. "It's looking for us," she whispered. Mark grabbed her hand. "Run!" They bolted deeper into the woods, branches clawing at their clothes and faces. The lantern's light flickered through the trees, following them. The heavy crunch of boots on dry leaves and the faint, unnatural hum grew louder. Rachel's foot caught on a root, sending her sprawling to the ground. "Get up!" Mark hissed, helping her to her feet. The light was almost upon them now, the figure's skeletal hand outstretched. Mark grabbed a heavy branch and swung it as the figure lunged forward. The branch connected with the lantern, shattering the glass. The light flared brightly, illuminating the woods in a ghostly glow before extinguishing. The oppressive presence vanished instantly, leaving only the sounds of the forest. For a moment, they stood frozen, their ragged breathing the only sound. The woods were eerily still, the unnatural glow replaced by faint moonlight filtering through the trees. "Is it gone?" Rachel asked, her voice barely audible. Mark nodded, though his hands were still shaking. "We need to get back to the car." They stumbled back to the road, their legs weak and unsteady. When they reached the car, it was still there, though the flat tire remained. Mark worked quickly to replace it, his hands fumbling with the tools. Rachel kept watch, her eyes darting nervously between the road and the woods. Finally, the tire was changed, and they climbed back into the car. Mark started the engine, and they sped away without looking back. The road stretched on, the dense trees eventually giving way to open fields. The oppressive weight that had pressed on them seemed to lift, and the air felt lighter. Neither of them spoke until they crossed the state line. Rachel glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. In the distance, far beyond where they had been, A faint light flickered, swaying gently among the trees. Mark tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "We're never coming back here." Rachel nodded silently, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Deep in the shadows of that South Carolina road, the headless soldier and his lantern remained, waiting for the next unsuspecting travelers